Well, I guess I never thought I'd be sitting here. Definitely never thought I would be making this announcement. But this is the end. This is the end of the TinyHouseNC adventure. It's kind of bittersweet. I've been on this adventure now for almost 7 years with TinyHouseNC, and I think it's time to let it go. So let me back up some and tell you a little bit about how it all started. Back in 2014, myself and 3 other North Carolina tiny house folk had this idea that we would start kind of a statewide initiative for tiny houses. They were becoming more accepted, more popular, more present, and North Carolina was one of the states that was really doing it on the big scale. There were a lot of counties, a lot of cities, a lot of towns that were starting to allow tiny houses of different sizes and shapes. I think one of the reasons for that is a lot of North Carolina is still rural. So because of that, there are a lot of lax laws in terms of what you can live in full time. There's a lot of single wide trailers, a lot of modular units, a lot of park models, a lot of RVs that people live in full time. So the zoning is a little bit lax in some areas, especially the more rural you are. And we wanted to capitalize on that. Myself, I had been living with my wife and my daughter in a tiny house on wheels, 240 square feet, for about 2 years legally, and in eastern North Carolina. And I had heard of some folks just outside of Raleigh that were doing it, Winston-Salem, around Wilmington. So I thought, there's something here. So we got to talking, the 4 of us, and we decided that we would put together a group, kind of an unofficial, non-legal entity called TinyHouseNC. And so that's exactly what we did. We hired somebody to do a little logo for us, and I built a small website, and we decided, hey, we'll just kind of start by aggregating information and material that was already out there, or that we were already posting on our own websites. So that's what we did. And the others just felt like they were too involved with their own projects to kind of give it the attention it deserved. And so I was given the blessing to move forward with it, if I had a real interest, to move forward with it. And I did. I wanted to really cultivate TinyHouseNC. In fact, at the time, I had this notion that I would do TinyHouseNC, TinyHouseSC, TinyHouseGA, TinyHouse TN, and I would start these southern state consortiums for tiny house enthusiasts. But TinyHouseNC really took off for me. It was something that was near and dear to my heart, and because I was working through the process of living legally in a tiny house on wheels, I thought that's what I knew most about. So that's where I went. Fast forward a couple of years, TinyHouseNC was still going strong. We had been doing some workshops under the name TinyHouseNC. We had been meeting with other people, bringing people into the fold, that sort of thing. And I got this notion that TinyHouseNC should host a festival of sorts. This was back in like 2016 when tiny house festivals were kind of all the rage, and they were happening all over the place. It was just after the first tiny house jamboree, which took place in Colorado. So it seemed like the time was right. So I got this notion and I started fleshing it out, and I asked my wife if she would support me in doing this. And she said, yeah, if that's something you feel like we're supposed to do, let's do it. And she kind of, she didn't really have to, but we kind of talked about it. And the thing was, if we were going to do it, we were going to do it right. We were going to do it full out, ended up being about 140%. And in 2017, we had the first TinyHouseNC Street Festival in Pink Hill, North Carolina. That first festival had attracted 16 tiny houses on wheels, 4 schoolies, and 2 vans to exhibit or to show off or to allow tours, that sort of thing. Most of the houses came from North Carolina. I really put an emphasis on keeping it North Carolina strong. And we had food trucks. We had a great coffee shop that was built into a tiny house. We had some speakers on the main stage. We had a couple of workshops. It really just turned out to be an exciting adventure. We ended up welcoming about 6,000 people to the festival that year, which exceeded the number of people that I thought would attend by roughly 5,999. So it went over really, really well. We got a lot of press. A lot of states started going, hey, we could do something like that, or we could, kind of have the same sort of thing. And so I started getting more and more invites to help people with their festivals, or to host their festivals, or to, kind of write a guide about how to do festivals, which I did. I wrote a guide and I did some blog posts and things like that. Now, you have to know that along this time, I had also written, I was working on my second book that was centered around the modern tiny house movement. I had written umpteen thousand blog posts. I was already working with Tiny House Magazine as the content editor. I was in a couple of documentaries, just a lot of different things, a lot of opportunities that came out of both my original site, Tiny Revolution, and then TinyHouseNC. And so that was cool. So we had that first festival. I'm super pleased with how that turned out. And I still look back at it and I think, if I don't do anything else in my lifetime, that was super cool. I mean, to have my wife there and my daughter and my parents and even my siblings helped out. It was awesome. Like, it was so cool. So we tried to capture lightning in a bottle, and we hosted another one in 2018, and it exceeded even 2017. We welcomed, I think, right at 9,000 people into a town that typically has 1,200 people. We had even more tiny houses. We did not do a main stage that year, but we had more workshops. We had a vendor showcase. We had great food trucks again. We had more press. This time we had press from all over the nation. It was super cool. We had entertainment on a stage. It was so cool. I wish I could accurately describe how much fun it was, because until that time, workshops really were, festivals really were kind of a large open space, a big green space, and kind of in wagon train form. Tiny houses would kind of move, form a circle, and you would just kind of walk from house to house to house. But what we tried to do with the street festival was really develop the feeling of what it would be like to live in a neighborhood that was comprised of tiny houses. So in Pink Hill, North Carolina, we took over the main street and we lined the street with tiny houses. I had a couple of sponsors that donated some landscaping things, some shrubs and some plants and things like that. So we had those set up at the houses. So it really gave that vibe of like, this is what it would be like if tiny houses were legalized, and we could have neighborhoods where tiny houses were the primary structures. So I was really proud of that. Again, siblings helped out. My wife, my daughter, friends of mine signed on to help out. It was a cool experience. But then, after 2018, in thinking about 2019, doing a third one, I really started to question, how could it be any better? Like, how could I top myself, or how could we top the festival? Where was TinyHouseNC going? Things were starting to get really hot legally. Appendix Q was making headlines across the nation. People were putting together a lot of politically based ideas for tiny houses and tiny house villages. And I just felt like that's not where my passion was. That's not what I wanted to do. And so I kind of put TinyHouseNC on a back burner. and I decided not to have another festival. I wanted to go out on top, so I decided not to try a third festival. And I kind of gave the website and the blog and the workshops, I kind of just put them on the back burner, just put them on hold. Well, 2019 turned into 2020. By this point, my wife and my daughter and I had been living, or still are, living in a small house of about 900 heated square feet, 1,000 square feet, something like that. Our lives are different now. They were different starting back in like 2017 even, and because that's always been my thought about the modern tiny house movement, is that tiny house, what a tiny house is really relative to who lives inside of it. And a house, by definition, should expand with the needs of the family. The family shouldn't have to fill the house. The house should accommodate the family. And as our family began to grow and we got interested more in homesteading and things like that, our needs for a home changed. And so we were no longer living in a tiny house, and I was doing a lot of work in some other various areas. At the time, I had just finished up a college curriculum for post-World War II housing in America. I had written a couple more chapters in books, not full books, but just inclusions in books. And I started focusing more on small houses and reclaiming houses, homes with good bones, things like that. It was a natural progression, but it was still a progression, and it still took me away from just exclusively tiny houses. And so that kind of brings me where I am right now. About probably 8 or 9 months ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, I had this idea that TinyHouseNC should live on, but probably not with me. I'm not the right person anymore. And so I had been secretly kind of looking at who was doing things in North Carolina, who was really making efforts and making progress and that sort of thing. And so that's when I came up with the names of Peter and Mary. And they had already started TinyHouseNC, and they had grown a great group of advocates in the state, and they were putting together some interesting things in various areas, especially metropolitan and urban areas. And so I thought, you know what? I think these are the people to take over. And so I talked to them about just that, about taking it over. Lock, stock, and barrel. The logo, the taglines, the website, the mailing list, everything. And it was so obvious. It was such an obvious choice. And so that's kind of why I'm here today, because I'm letting go. I'm letting TinyHouseNC go, and I'm passing it on to a new generation of people that are going to love it and cultivate it and grow it even more. And so I'm glad that you're part of that audience. I'm glad that you have gotten to be part of this experience. I encourage you to continue to sow into the state of North Carolina, continue to press our politicians to look at alternative housing, to look at affordable housing, to look at structures not just as ways to build a tax base, but as ways to provide affordable and comfortable housing for all people, despite their socioeconomic class. And so that's what's happening. So today, I bid adieu. I am no longer going to be at the helm of TinyHouseNC. Tiny House Revolution will remain an archive site for forevermore, I suppose. But TinyHouseNC is going to get a breath of new life, and I'm excited by that. I know there's going to be some merging of Tiny Living NC and TinyHouseNC, but I think it's going to be a bright future, and I'm excited about it. And so I want to thank you for all these years that you've given me, that you've allowed me to sow into the state, into the movement, and just be part of something really exciting. So take care. I'll see you on Facebook, I guess. I'll see you maybe at the festivals and the workshops. In the meantime, keep North Carolina strong. Keep us at the forefront of the modern tiny house movement. We have a great legacy to hold on to. Take care.